To this afternoon's presentation, The Gaza Crisis, How We Got There and Where Do We Go Next, featuring Professor Amaney Jamal. I'm Chris Woolforth. I'm the Associate Director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, one of the co-sponsors of today's events. Today's presentation is part of a series of perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian crisis that we've been running for you this year, brought to you by the Dickey Center for International Understanding, the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, Dartmouth Hillel, and Students Concerned for Palestine. The aim of the series is to offer a variety of perspectives on the crisis in an effort to spark an open, informed, and constructive dialogue on the subject. Thus far in the series, we have heard from the Consul General from Israel to New England, the Chargé d'Affaires of the PLO mission in Washington, D.C. Today and tomorrow, we will have two other perspectives on the crisis. Today's program featuring Professor Jamal, and tomorrow's program featuring Middle East consultant Gordon Zaks, who will be speaking in defense of Israel's right to defend itself. Our series co-sponsors are joined by Chabad in making Mr. Zaks' visits possible tomorrow. There is perhaps no current international conflict that stirs the passions more than the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. It is a relatively straightforward story of battle over territory, complicated by dueling historical, religious, and moral claims, undercut by the deaths of innocents on both sides, amplified by regional and global tensions, and all in an area about the size of the state of Vermont. Helping us make some sense of this complexity is our guest today, Amaney Jamal, who is an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University. Professor Jamal is a comparative political scientist whose work focuses on the nexus between the state and civil society, and she has worked throughout the Arab world. She has also paid particular interest to the role of gender in Arab states and the evolution of Arab Americans as a group in the United States after 9/11. She is the author of Barriers to Democracy, The Other Side of Social Capital in Palestine and the Arab World, which won the 2008 Best Book Award in Comparative Democratization from the American Political Science Association. Barriers to Democracy is notable in that Jamal uses her research in Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco to problematize the relationship between a robust civil society and democracy that has been the hallmark of our understanding of democracy since Alexis de Tocqueville. Flourishing civic associations, believed to be essential to American-style democracy, can support authoritarian regimes just as well, as Jamal's research in the Arab world demonstrates. Jamal has also turned her analytical skills on Arab Americans, having contributed to two books on the subject of Arab Americans after 9/11. Race and Arab Americans After 9/11, From Invisible Citizens to Visible Subjects, with Nadine Neighbor on Syracuse University Press, and Citizenship and Crisis, Arab Detroit After 9/11, forthcoming from the Russell Sage Foundation. She is currently at work on a new book entitled Of Empires and Citizens, State-Society Relations in the Arab World. She has published widely on comparative politics in the Arab world and contributed to numerous media interviews. She has enjoyed the support of numerous grants as well for her research, including those from the Luce Initiative on Religion and International Affairs, the United States Institute of Peace, a Carnegie Scholarship, and the Russell Sage Foundation. Jamal's work is notable for its employment of survey data and open interviews of ordinary citizens throughout the Middle East. Interviews she conducts herself, often at great personal risk. She is perhaps, to this fact, the most knowledgeable person in the United States on what the man and the woman on the street in the Middle East is thinking. Who better then to walk us through the Gaza crisis, how we got here, and where do we go next? Please join me in welcoming Professor Amaney Jamal.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that great introduction. And I'd like to thank Dartmouth College for hosting my visit here today. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. If anybody has a problem with the volume or anything, just please let me know. Chris asked me to talk about the Gaza situation, kind of how we got here, where do we go next, and more or less present the Palestinian perspective on the conflict. And that's what I hope to do today. But before we get into the Gaza conflict per se, I think we need just to go back a few years, or at least look at the 16 years under the Oslo Accords to kind of get us at where we are today with the Gaza situation. Oftentimes what we hear here in the Western media is that Palestinian and Israeli differences are irreconcilable. There are huge differences that cannot be mediated, that an Israeli will always be an Israeli, a Palestinian will always be a Palestinian, and there's so much hatred, and there's so much misunderstanding, and there's so much mistrust, that reconciliation is above and beyond any foreseeable objective in that area of the world. And what I want to posit here and say with full confidence, having been in Israel and in Palestine, that's not true. And in fact, I've always said, and I always remark, that I've had better and more constructive dialogues in Israel and Palestine than we often have here in the United States, which is really unfortunate. We happen to be a very polarized society here in the United States on these issues. So putting that aside, I also want to say that Israelis and Palestinians do get along together. Israelis and Palestinians can see each other as ordinary human beings. Israeli and Palestinians can see each other's children as children born into the conflict with the right to grow up as decent human beings. However, unfortunately today, when we look at the conflict and where the conflict is, we don't really see or capture that in terms of where the political stalemate now exists. So since 1993, and since the Oslo Peace Accords, we just need to look at a few empirical realities on the ground to kind of showcase, if you may, the Palestinian perspective on the conflict. The Palestinians, along with Israel, entered into a mutual peace process where the Israelis, for the first time, recognized that the Palestinians will have a right to an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank in Gaza, and the Palestinians granted Israel its right to exist on land that was up, or the land that was up to the 1967 war, or what we call the 67 borders, right? So basically, the Oslo framework was premised on this mutual recognition of each political entity having legitimate claims to the West Bank and Gaza for the Palestinians and to Israel for the Israelis. However, 16 years into the peace process, if we look at the empirical realities on the West Bank, today 50% of the West Bank, after 16 years of the Oslo Peace Accords and during the Oslo Peace Accords, 50% of the West Bank has been appropriated for settlements, for bypass roads, for checkpoints, and for the separation wall, right? That's 50% of the West Bank that should constitute a future Palestinian independent state has been already appropriated by Israel, and as a result, what we have is a piece of territory on the West Bank that lacks unity, that is not unified in any meaningful way to facilitate economic development. And you cannot understand the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict without understanding the dire economic situation that exists in Gaza, which is just a humanitarian crisis, but also in the West Bank. Any peace agreement, any peace process needs to really address the ability of the Palestinian entity to be able to sustain itself economically. If the West Bank is not an economically viable state, it will forever be a territory of land populated by close to 2-3 million citizens that needs to be economically revived by outsiders, right? So let's put this into perspective. So the major setbacks I put forward today is basically the issue of territory, the territory of the West Bank now, and the economic conditions linked with Oslo. And before I get into the territory, I just want to talk about the economic conditions. After Oslo, Palestinians have systematically experienced a decline in their everyday living standards. Per capita income between 1994 and 1996 fell by 17%. In 1998, right, the number of people living in poverty, those earning less than $2 a day, was 37% in Gaza and close to 15% on the West Bank. Unemployment, which before 1993, before Oslo, was at 5%, reached 28% by 1996. The pressure of unemployment is all the more significant given the youthfulness of the Palestinian population. Over 47% of the Palestinian population is under the age of 15, and fertility rates are among the highest recorded in the Middle East. Every unemployed person represents a 6-member family. Now, moving forward to the Al-Aqsa Intifada of 2000-2001, there were further closures, and I'd like to talk about the closures as they also relate to Israel's security interests, but the closures devastated the Palestinian economy further, and it re-emphasized to the ordinary Palestinian population that their individual welfare, measured by GDP, hinges on open trade relations with Israel rather than on the capacity of the Palestinian economy to become autonomous. It's become very clear that any future Palestinian economy will always be linked and wed to the Israeli economy. And in order for a Palestinian economy to be viable, it needs to have access to open borders. So this dependency is not simply the result of Israel's 33-year economic domination of the territories. It is also the outcome of Israel's unilateral control of borders and its regulation of Palestinian economic life with a now institutionalized permit system. Workers, merchants, and managers seeking to enter Israel or to take goods through Israel must acquire security clearance from the Israeli military and be controlled at border checkpoints or risk imprisonment. Apart from its dehumanizing aspect, the permit system involves high transaction costs and losses. A study conducted in 1998 found that Palestinian businesses seeking to export or import through Israeli ports face transaction costs that are on average 35% higher than what Israeli firms are subjected to. So at least it really puts the Palestinian labor and workforce at a huge disadvantage when it needs to compete with Israeli merchants in terms of importing and exporting goods. The economic performance of the Palestinian Authority has also not necessarily helped the Palestinians either. Despite generating over 120,000 jobs in the public sector, the Palestinian Authority has been unable to absorb the huge unemployment capital. Most of the jobs that the PA created were jobs in the security forces, hence the Palestinians, at least in the 1990s, had one of the most saturated, overinflated security bureaucracies in the world, and especially if we look at per capita security. And in 1999, the public sector alone employed 13% of those working in the West Bank and almost 26% of all workers in Gaza. The PA, and I've written about this extensively in my book On Barriers to Democracy, the PA has also failed to develop a transparent legal system or to encourage private sector development. Rather, it encouraged the development of monopolies and deepened its financial reliance on Israel. The customs union established by Oslo between Israel and the Palestinian territories entitles the Palestinian economy to levies on goods passing through Israel and headed to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. 2/3 of the total PA revenue between 1994 and 1998 has come from customs due, but the revenue has not been used to encourage productive public sector investment, productive private sector investment. A limited class of PA-affiliated companies and individuals are monopolizing rent and benefiting from Israel. The Palestinian Commercial Service Company, which is fully owned by the Palestinian Authority, holds majority shares in the 34 major Palestinian companies. And in 1999, this entity held assets totaling $345 million, or close to 8% of the entire Palestinian GDP. So there was a lot of also corruption, if you may, and mismanagement on the side of the Palestinian Authority. Basically, if you look at the economic trajectory since Oslo, it is an economic trajectory that has only worsened because of the inability of Palestinians to have economic control over their futures, especially economic control over their borders. Not only, I want to make sure I'm clear about this, not only the economic borders between Palestine and Israel, or the West Bank and Israel, but also economic borders within the West Bank, right? So we're talking about the ability of manufacturers or tradesmen and workers to transport goods between Nablus in the north and Ramallah, from Ramallah to Bethlehem or Hebron. These are areas now that are all controlled and segregated by checkpoints. And this is where the territorial issues become apparent. Now, this is at the eve of the Oslo Accords. By 1995, here's the map of the West Bank. And if you look at, there's often this misconception that the Palestinians had it all. They had an entire state on the West Bank, and they kind of blew that opportunity away, right? If they had done things right, they would now have an independent state. But the reality is they never had control over much of the West Bank. In fact, if we look at all territory, which is earmarked Area A, right, this is where the Palestinians were given full civil and military control. They controlled 17%. At the best days of Oslo, they controlled 17% of of the West Bank, right? And then Area B was full Palestinian civil control and joint Israeli-Palestinian military control. These are where the Palestinians and the Israelis were coordinating quite effectively together in securing and governing these areas. And we often, again, back to my breaking down the stereotype about the Israelis and Palestinians not being able to get along. These Area B controlled areas, if you travel in the West Bank during this time period, what you would see is that these areas were jointly controlled with Israeli and Palestinians. The Israeli and Palestinian soldiers would be sitting, playing backgammon at the entrance points and the exit points of these areas. You'd see an Israeli and Palestinian flag. The security information was jointly controlled. In other words, if you had a Palestinian security laptop and an Israeli security laptop, the servers were connected. So you had direct exchange of ideas. So there was a lot of coordination in these areas. Then you had Area C, which was the area of West Bank territory that remained under full Israeli control. And it was the vast majority of the territory, right? And all of these areas were segmented and fragmented, right? So this is the map under the best days of Oslo. Moving forward, well, by 2000, you could also see that the Palestinian autonomous areas, the darker shaded areas, were more or less increasingly fragmented from one another. And what you saw is an increase in Israeli settlements on the West Bank during the time period of Oslo. Now look at Oslo was a framework for Palestinians and Israelis to recognize each other based on the premise of a two-state solution. And during this time period, the percentage of land appropriated, if you may, for settlement activity alone was, you saw an increase of almost 100% of land appropriations for settlements. Now, often you'll hear that, oh, well, the settlements are expanding to accommodate natural birth rates. But even Israeli reports will tell you that what was needed to accommodate the natural growth rates of the settlement population was 8% of the total land that was actually appropriated. So in other words, 92% of the land appropriated for settlement activity was not for accommodating the natural birth rate of the settlement population. So if you look at all these little triangles here are the settlements on the West Bank. And the big Palestinian concern is, how can there be a Palestinian state on the West Bank when basically you have Israeli settlements scattered across this territory? I mean, what type of political system is going to allow for this? How will the settlement populations be represented under a Palestinian state, right? So this is a big issue. 74 new outposts or settlement outposts. These are the ones outside of Jerusalem. 74 settlement outposts emerged after the Oslo Accord on the West Bank. Then we get to the Camp David talks, and basically it's there that the world is told that Arafat was offered basically the sky and the moon and everything in between, and he turned it down. Here's the map that was offered to Yasser Arafat at Camp David. This is the Camp David under the Clinton initiative. And what you see is that what the Israelis were willing to offer Arafat was a West Bank that would be divided into three pieces, right? You would have the Northwest Bank, Center West Bank, and the Southwest Bank. All the borders would have been controlled by Israel, and the Palestinians, there would have been no means to economically, if you may, trade and travel between the two territories without going through Israeli-controlled checkpoints, right? So in a sense, if you're going to have an independent Palestinian state, it can't be fragmented into three territories, first of all. So this was a huge issue, a major source of contention during the negotiations at Camp David, by all accounts, we often hear about the right of return or the refugee problem being an outstanding issue in Camp David. At least in my interviews with some of the negotiators at Camp David, what I was told, and I don't know if this is true, but what I was told is that the refugee issues were pretty much taken care of. Those were resolved. And there was a formula that the Israelis and Palestinians both agreed to. I don't think it was going to be necessarily favorable to the Palestinians, but nevertheless, that was one of the issues that they kind of agreed to. What wasn't agreed to, and what was really a source of contention, was this map and the issue of sovereignty on Jerusalem, right, on East Jerusalem. To what extent would the Palestinians have sovereignty on the holy sites of East Jerusalem? And I'd be more than happy to talk about that in question and answer. There was disagreement. The Palestinians didn't sign the and it must. I need to point out here also, it's not like the Israelis were really also, gang ho on this agreement. I mean, this was like pulling teeth out of both the Israelis and the Palestinians at Camp David. Nevertheless, at Sharm el-Sheikh, the subsequent meetings after Camp David, this is when the Clinton administration was just about to leave office, they all met, the Israelis and Palestinians met in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they resolved these two issues. The divisions between the West Bank were more or less, I guess, patched together. So you had more of a contiguous territory here. But of course, the Al-Aqsa Intifada emerges, and this map never goes into effect. But nevertheless, it exists, and it's out there. And this is one that the Palestinians were willing to agree to, and at least it seems that at least under Ehud Barak, there was consensus that this might be the way to go. This has been tabled 10 years later. We're nowhere close to that final status kind of map, if you may. Today, if you look then now at the original Oslo map and kind of where we are today, what you see is that what's emerged, and when people talk about a future Palestinian state, they're really talking about a Palestinian state that is now confined along the lines of the security barrier, right? The security barrier that has now emerged between the West Bank and Israel. And I want to point out, it's not only a security barrier that has emerged between the West Bank and Israel, it is a security barrier that divides the West Bank internally, right? So you could live over here in the West Bank, and if you're on the wrong side of the security border, that's it, you're out. Some 150,000 Palestinians somehow got dislocated with the security border, and they don't know where they belong. They're not Israeli, and they're Palestinian, but they're denied access into the territories. And if you look at, the security barrier and how it's being built, it's not including all of the land of the West Bank, right? So this is the major source of frustration, the major source of disappointment when you're talking to Palestinians is like, fine, on the one hand, Palestinians will say, yes, if this indeed is keeping the suicide bombers out of out of Israel, great, because we as a population won't suffer the repercussions of, Israeli retaliatory strikes or economic sanctions and whatnot. But what the grievance is that the security barrier is basically determining the future borders of a Palestinian state, and it's the future border that has basically appropriated a significant amount of West Bank territory. And if you look at where the future lines of the security wall and where that's kind of like, going, it doesn't really look good for the Palestinians. And again, the major source of concern here is that the southern part of the West Bank is going to be totally cut off from the northern part of the West Bank. So the major issues that we've put forward in terms of issues that are blocking the economic viability of a future Palestinian state will remain in effect. Plus, not only that, but the security border, I don't know if you guys have, or you've seen the security border, it's a huge mammoth wall and you only have very specific entry points and very specific times where you can enter and exit these borders. So if the conditions under Oslo were not conducive to economic viability, for sure, this situation is not going to be conducive to a future economically independent Palestinian entity, which means we kind of like are bracketing the big issues, trying to ignore them while we think about what type of future Palestinian state will there be. So for the Palestinians at least, Oslo really hasn't given them much. Hasn't given them a better economic future. and it hasn't really given them a meaningful way to see a future Palestinian state. If we ask people today, do you ever think you're going to have a future Palestinian state? At least public opinion polls will tell you about 10% of the Palestinians believe they're ever going to have their own state today on the West Bank and Gaza. So then, oh, and I just need to point out, on the West Bank also, you know, in that territory with all the land being appropriated for the separation wall and for settlements, you also have 700 checkpoints now scattered across the West Bank. Now, I can understand why you would need checkpoints around these areas where there's no security barrier, right? But I don't understand, especially when I'm traveling through the West Bank, why if I want to visit a relative in Ramallah, I have to go through 3 checkpoints, Israeli checkpoints. And so that's a big question and I'm going to put it out there because I really find that there's no meaningful purpose for those except to basically impose an occupation on citizens that really have been living under Israeli occupation for way too long, and it serves no short-term or security objective at all. So I put that out there. These are all the checkpoints scattered across the West Bank. And, you know, you often think that, oh, no big deal. It's like, it's not like when you go through the Israeli checkpoints on the West Bank, like you're going through the border of the United States through Canada. They just look at your documents and they let you through. You get harassed at the borders. You get put aside in the middle of the heat for no good reason because, you know, the Israeli soldiers still have to have their lunch. You could be waiting in an hour and a half in the car while your baby is crying because, you know what, they just don't feel like checking you through right now. So this is intimidation on these borders. And for students, I mean, if you look at just Ramallah, which I'm most familiar with, the surrounding villages, I mean, the consequences are just dire. Because in a lot of the surrounding villages, for example, the school system goes only to the elementary level, right? And for young students to get a high school education or to finish high school or to access colleges, they have to be able to get into the city, to get into Ramallah, right? Now, what's happened now since this checkpoint system, and because we're dealing with conservative and traditional society, more or less, is that parents will say, okay, well, boys, you guys can go into the city. If you guys go through 3 checkpoints and the Israelis want to pat you down and check you, that's fine. You guys are boys, we're fine. But you know what? The young girls, you guys stay at home. And so we've seen a decline in women's education. We've seen a decline in female education. So the consequences, forget about the future state and forget about the political consequences, but we're just talking about the social consequences. The advancements in terms of just, you know, creating gender equality, making sure the young girls have full access to education, making sure young women have access to health care. I mean, all the social human development indicators that we deem important for our universal values are being impeded by the system of checkpoints across the West Bank. So I'll just keep that there as well. So then, and just to look at, here are like some images of checkpoints, right? So these are students trying to get to school and trying to find an alternate route through the checkpoints. And this is, they have to walk through the mountains to get to schools. I mean, these are not very friendly checkpoints. These are workers lining up in Gaza trying to get through into Israel to access labor. These, again, are Israeli soldiers and Palestinians scuffling through the mountains because the Palestinians are not supposed to be in the mountains trying to get into the cities, and the Israelis are trying to push them back. And again, workers lining up. So this is the daily reality of Palestinians on the West Bank, moving on the West Bank, getting around the West Bank. This is not Palestinians trying to enter, well, I guess these citizens are entering Israel. But we're talking about here life on the West Bank in general. Okay, so then by 2001, we have the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Yasser Arafat, it's no longer clear where his political loyalties are. Up until 2000, the US, along with Israel, had invested a lot in Yasser Arafat as the leader of the Palestinian Authority. The United States was very keen on Arafat maintaining peace and calm on the West Bank, and as a result, we funneled millions of dollars to Yasser Arafat to expand his security services, as I pointed out. And, you know, he was very manipulative, knowing how to use those monies to enhance his own kind of authoritarian standing also. Then it became clear that he was losing credibility internally in Palestine, and he wasn't basically able to quell the situation. And then all of a sudden, the democracy discourse emerges, which basically more or less, at least the U.S. and Israeli push for democracy was, let's figure out ways to limit Yasser Arafat's executive control over the Palestinian society. In principle, that's right on target, because a lot of these Arab leaders have too much control of the executive branch, and they rule more or less authoritatively. So with the democracy promotion initiatives was this idea of, let's weaken the executive branch, let's weaken Yasser Arafat, let's empower the legislative branch, because there's this reform movement within Fatah that may ostensibly capture majority support, and that way we can move the peace process forward. What the Israeli and U.S. vision never really addresses during this whole democracy from like 2001 to 2006, if you may, is the idea that if you want a credible leadership among the Palestinians, you have to empower the leadership politically. It's not suffice to say, we want democracy because democracy is better, or it suits our interest right now, or it doesn't, right? You need to also empower the leaderships politically. And when these leaderships are going, whether it's Abbas or Arafat, are going year in and year out back to their people with no advancements on the peace process, with more lands being appropriated, with the future Palestinian state all but withering away, they're not going to be seen as credible political actors even among their own population. So I'm going to put that aside. But all of a sudden we began hearing, for example, when the Palestinians negotiators met with Condoleezza Rice in 2004 in Berlin, they said, why can't we just jump to the final status issues? Let's just negotiate. Let's just get this negotiation process over with. And what Condoleezza Rice's reply to them was, we're sitting in Germany. Its borders were settled in 1991, but by then it was already a successful democracy. That's what you need to think about, building successful democratic institutions first. So it was always this idea about, let's postpone the peace process, let's postpone your issues, your political issues, just focus on being a democratic society, right? Because the democratic society will be useful for the peace process. But, if you look at least the empirical realities in the region, it's not like Jordan was a democracy when it signed a peace treaty with Israel, and that was a durable peace treaty. It's not like Egypt was in 1979 was a democracy when it signed a durable peace treaty with Israel, right? And all of a sudden the Palestinians were expected to be democratic. So the push was for democracy, and lo and behold, you had the 2006 elections, in which, if we compare all Arab countries in terms of looking at voter turnout, what you see in Palestine in the 2006 elections, you had the highest turnout in all the Arab countries. So by all accounts, it at least captured the interest of the constituents. And if you look at public opinion data across the Arab world that says in the last elections, and here we're referring to the Palestinian elections in 2006, but and then each of the individual elections in their own countries, do you think your last elections were free and fair? And among the Palestinians, 90% felt that their 2006 elections were free and fair. So by all accounts of all the democracy observers on the ground, and you had so many democracy observers on the ground during the 2006 election, these were democratic elections, right? And they yielded a result that nobody could really deal with, the Hamas victory, right? Now, really, really briefly, what I also often hear is like, how incredible is it that the Palestinians would vote a Hamas leadership into power, and more or less as a result of their exercising their democratic rights the wrong way, they kind of deserve what they got later on. So let me put everything in perspective. First of all, before I go to the bullets, Hamas didn't receive the majority of the Palestinian vote. It did not. It received 44% of the Palestinian vote. But because you had the Swedes, really the Swedes, designing the most democratic system of governments in terms of how votes were allocated to seats, it kind of translated in more seats at the end. Let me explain it further. Let's say you're in a district, small district. 2 seats would emerge from each district. And Hamas was very strategic, so it ran, let's say, 1 competent individual in each district, whereas Fatah ran 10 individuals in each district, which meant that, like, let's say the Fatah votes were all diluted, And so Hamas was able to monopolize on this system, and as a result, it ended up with 72% of the seats in parliament, right? So that was the reality of the situation. The democratic observers were telling Fatah not to do that, but of course, Fatah was such an overinflated and corrupt bureaucracy, they just couldn't get beyond their egos, I suppose, and realize that this would be a mistake. And they kept running these people in the same districts in the same manner, and they ended up losing. They lost handsomely, if you may. Furthermore, Hamas was able to capitalize on the failures of Oslo, right? This needs to be front and center. I mean, their electoral slogan was, Israel and the U.S. want Fatah. What do you think, right? And this resonated widely among the Palestinian population. You had entire Christian cities, towns in the West Bank that voted majority Hamas. I mean, if you study Palestinian public opinion or you know anything about Palestine, this is unheard of, right? Because Oslo was disappointing. Remember, nothing was done under Oslo to empower the Fatah government, but also Fatah was a corrupt government. It misused its power. It created a system of patronage and privilege, and exacerbated the income gaps between rich and poor. So in all, you know, if all of a sudden you're given a democratic opportunity to express your interest, you're going to vote against the government that has done nothing for you, and hopefully vote for a government that will do more for you. And so just keep that in mind, because what Hamas was promising people was to at least end the reign of corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And 53% of the people who voted for Hamas believed that Hamas would be more effective in fighting corruption. And I need to say and emphasize that the vote for Hamas was not against Israel or against a two-state solution. 67% of those who voted for Hamas, of Hamas voters, said that they believed Hamas should continue to seek a two-state solution. And there was a lot of push internally for Hamas to negotiate with Israel as the elected leader. But immediately, I'll get back to the public opinion, but immediately the international knee-jerk response was no, this was a democratic experience that had gone wrong, and that the international community was not going to honor those elections, so that they had to reverse what had already happened. And the way to do that was basically to suffocate the Palestinian government. Now, I've already said that about 120,000 Palestinians were on the direct payroll of the Palestinian Authority. So when the U.S., along with the international community, placed sanctions on the government, in effect what it was doing was denying teachers their salaries, was denying public servants their salaries, was denying the security forces their salaries. And this, you already had an economically devastated population, and this led really to a humanitarian crisis, especially in Gaza. 80% by the middle of 2006, 80% of the Gaza population depended on humanitarian aid for their daily subsistence. That's a huge level of poverty. Another thing I want to point out about the issue of support for Hamas and how that is structured. It's not a monolithic movement, right? Hamas support has fluctuated since the Oslo Accords. And I want to just point out that what we see is that support for Hamas ebbs and flows with the political realities of the day. So by 1994, 20% of the population said they supported Hamas. By 1995-96, when Hamas decides to boycott the Palestinian elections, it loses a lot of credibility on the Palestinian street, right? Because Palestinians thought, okay, you know, Hamas is not really playing fair right now. They want to destroy the peace process. We need to give the peace process a chance. So look at this. Support for Hamas almost falls by half here. And then as things start, turning more sour, if you may, support for Hamas gradually increases. By 2006, here's 2005, Mahmoud Abbas is elected. There's hope that now, Arafat is now dead. Mahmoud Abbas is now elected. There might be more significant movement on the peace process. That doesn't happen, and popularity for Hamas soars again. So the fact that you see such fluctuation is telling, and the fluctuation is happening along the lines of the political realities of the time and the day. Okay, so this is kind of, if you may, the political context, the economic context of the last 16 years of the Oslo Accords. And we missed a lot of important, in my opinion, opportunities to empower the Fatah government in Palestine before Hamas won the elections. We could have done more to empower Arafat during the peace process. We could have empowered Abbas post-2005 after he was elected. We gave him, I mean, he has accomplished nothing in terms of a Palestinian leader trying to win concessions from Israel in the peace negotiations. And then when Israel withdraws from Gaza later in 2005, that was also a unique opportunity to say to the Palestinian Authority, for Israel to say to the Palestinian Authority, we are going to hand Gaza over to you, and let's coordinate the administrative withdrawal and the political withdrawal, right? But Israel left in a vacuum and left it to Fatah and Hamas, to the warring factions, to have it out in Gaza. So keep this in mind. There's been very little coordination to empower the Fatah government, so it shouldn't be a shock that Fatah is not necessarily a popular movement in Palestine today. So then we get to the Gaza crisis. So what happens in December of 2008? Just really quick, we need to just put, again, a few things in perspective. We often assume that, oh, well, you know, Hamas is now running Gaza. It's an independent state. It's a functioning political society. It is not. The Gaza Strip is a strip of land confined by a military fence where the Palestinians don't have entry and exit access. They can't leave that strip for healthcare. They can't leave that strip for employment. They need to get permits. And if you think the permits on the West Bank are hard to secure, then you try getting a permit to leave Gaza. And it's hard then to economically transact from Gaza in Israel or elsewhere. So you have a strip of land that is managed by Israel, if you may, because it's controlled by Israel in terms of its borders. It has 1.5 million citizens. Every square mile in Gaza has 10,000 citizens. If you compare that to Princeton, New Jersey, in every 1 square mile there we have 1,000 citizens, right? So it's a highly densely populated area. In fact, some people will say it's the most highly densely populated area on the face of the earth. When we talk about the economic blockade on Gaza, again, I just want to emphasize, it's not a blockade only designed to keep out weapons. I mean, of course, the blockade should keep out weapons, and we're not going to disagree with that. But the idea is that the economic blockade keeps out, until very recently, pasta, diapers, building materials, electrical appliances such as refrigerators and washing machines, spare car parts, fabrics, threads, needles, light bulbs, candles, matches, books, musical instruments, crayons, clothing, shoes, mattresses, sheets, blankets, cups, glasses, and animals. Many of the banned products are imported now through the tunnel system. The tunnel system is a huge economic enterprise right now in Gaza. So I just want to keep in mind, when we say the economic blockade on Gaza, it is an economic blockade that has really suffocated the population of Gaza. Again, 80% of the population of Gaza today relies on humanitarian assistance for their everyday subsistence needs. So the devastation in Gaza led to 1,430 Palestinians killed during the Gaza incursion. Over 5,300 Palestinians were wounded. In excess of 90,000 people were displaced by the bombings. The devastation was so severe that the UNDP officials estimated that even should Gaza's crossings be reopened fully today and consistently remain that way, it would take 5 years to repair the damage that was inflicted on Gaza in that 1 month. Gaza's 7 main textile factories were damaged and closed, 22 of 29 concrete factories were devastated, and 60% of all agricultural land was harmed, leading to a virtual halt in agribusiness. Furthermore, you had 67 schools, 5 UN facilities, many of which were used as refugee sites or shelters, if you may, during the crisis. Furthermore, journalists were kept out, but for those of us who have access to Middle Eastern media, Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, those journalists were on the ground in Gaza, and it was a lot of devastation, right? It was sheer devastation and destruction. And people will say Israel has the right to defend itself, and I believe Israel does have the right to defend itself, and I believe that any state has the right to defend itself, but I also believe there's self-defense and then there's self-defense, right? And dropping continuous bombs on civilian populations in Gaza, where citizens were not allowed the opportunity to exit Gaza, is only going to lead to humanitarian destruction. And we can't sanction. And what was really troubling for me, as somebody who has really passionately observed the peace process, what was really troubling for me is that finally we had Israeli commentators and Palestinian commentators agreeing on something. So let me tell you, like Rashid Khaldi, pro-Palestinian scholar, said in the New York Times during this crisis, he said the only sense he could make out of this was that Israel was trying to send the Palestinians a message by exacting pain on the civilian population, that the Palestinians would always be a defeated people, right? So that in other words, Rashid Khaldi basically was arguing that the citizens were targets of the state of Israel, and this was fair game. We've never reached a point where citizens have been fair game, right? I mean, so far, the only people who have claimed that citizens have been a fair game are the suicide bombers and the terrorists, which we condemn. But that it's okay to cheer on a military onslaught on a citizen population has not been sanctioned. And we hadn't reached that level in the peace process. And Thomas Friedman said earlier, especially when referring to the Lebanese incursion in 2006, he said, what Israel has accomplished is deterrence at its best because they exacted enough pain on the civilian population to sanction Hezbollah internally in Lebanon. So in other words, they made it so painful that Hezbollah was going to lose credibility internally for the devastation it brought to Lebanon. And again, so this idea that citizens now are fair game in the ongoing war, it worries me because I haven't ever seen this discourse being legitimated and people basically saying and embracing it as if, yes, this is the only mode of deterrence that we have for this conflict. I mean, it's like as if there was no 16 years of a peace process. There was no mutual recognition and reconciliation. There were no maps. There were no ideas of joint security patrols and us working for a better future. Now it's like, who can exact the most civilian pain? And I just find where we are in this conflict, at astonishing levels. I mean, sometimes I talk to myself while I'm driving. I've never thought we were going to reach this point in where the conflict is. But let me tell you why I believe this whole exacting civilian pain, or let me put it more bluntly, there will be no military solution to this conflict. I believe there will only be a political solution to this conflict. And we did have hopeful signs of that. How? Nobody wants to talk about the fact that when Israel withdrew from Gaza, Khalid Mish'al put forward a proposal for calm. It wasn't a peace process or mutual recognition of the state of Israel, but he said, we will not fire rockets or launch missiles into Gaza in return for open borders and access to the open borders. And the borders will be controlled by the Europeans or some type of quartet configuration. Nobody paid attention to Mish'al's initiative in 2005. Yet, forget about that, in June of 2008, Hamas and Israel did strike a period of calm, or what is known in Arabic as the period of tahdi'ah. There were really almost 5 good months. It was a 6-month agreement, but we all know by the first month of November that agreement was falling apart. We were all focusing our attention on the elections here in the United States. But even the Israeli intelligence analyst reported that Hamas, during this 5 months, was chasing down the splinter groups in Gaza to make sure that no missiles were being launched into Gaza. Only 20 Qassam missiles were launched into Gaza during this time period for 5 months. Now compare that to the 1,000 Qassam missiles launched into Gaza during the incursion when Hamas was being bombed by Israel. They managed to get 1,000 missiles into Israel. So there was a 5-month tahdiya and calm between Hamas and Israel, but Israel did not open up the borders to the Palestinians. And again, the borders for Gaza are very important. I mean, you can't economically suffocate this population and pretend like they're going to be fine with it for a very long period of time. I mean, you have to give them something politically to empower them and to give them hope for a better future down the line. So again, I believe that the political solution is much more effective than the military solution. Now, other people, I guess that's just kind of reiterating what I just said, so excuse me, going forward. So after Gaza, what do we have? We had an already weak Palestinian Authority, or Mahmoud Abbas government, even more weakened. And again, if we didn't see a lot of what happened, or almost anything of what happened, if you may, in the Western media, but in the Middle Eastern media, Mahmoud Abbas was made out to be like a big, an insignificant Israeli-American collaborator. I mean, people were, the things that were said about Mahmoud Abbas were horrendous. I mean, he lost the Palestinian street, he lost the Arab street during that time period. In December of 2008, before the incursion, 28% of the Palestinians said they supported Hamas. By March 2009, after, Hamas popularity went up by 5 percentage points. Fatah was about 42% in December. In March, its popularity had fallen to 40%. But this is the more telling thing. If new presidential elections were held today and the two candidates were Ismail Haniyeh, leader of Hamas, and Mahmoud Abbas, the former receives 47% of the vote and the latter receives 45%. 3 months ago, Abbas received 48%. This is in December, before the incursion, and Haniyeh received 38%. So Haniyeh's popularity ratings have gone up 10% since the Gaza incursion. So Hamas was politically empowered by the whole Gaza incursion and has become even a more popular movement today. Then how did the whole Gaza situation end? You had a unilateral declaration of a ceasefire by Israel, right? They didn't negotiate a period of calm or anything with Hamas. They just decided to pull out of Gaza. There was a lot of international pressure granted. But the reason why there was also a unilateral ceasefire by Israel is that it became very clear to Israel that it was going to have to negotiate with Hamas. And that really worried the Israeli establishment, because all of a sudden Hamas is now the major address in Gaza. And you didn't go into Gaza to defeat Hamas, to only sit at the table and negotiate a peace treaty with Hamas or some type of political solution with Hamas that will politically empower them and keep them as the only political leadership in that territory. So keep that in mind. The U.S. committed to Israel that it would help monitor arms smuggling, at the borders. And my question is that, was the devastation of Gaza necessary to receive a U.S. commitment to monitor arms smuggling and to declare a unilateral ceasefire? So that needs to be kept in perspective as well. The myth of deterrence. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Israel concluded that while the Israeli army performed more effectively in Gaza than in Lebanon, its tactical gains against Hamas were short-term and no clear strategic benefit was achieved. And even further, if you look at new reports coming out, I'm going to quote, "The Israel-Hamas war has ended, but none of the factors that triggered it have been addressed. 3 months after unilateral ceasefires, Gaza's crossings are largely shut. Reconstruction and rehabilitation have yet to begin. Rockets periodically are fired into Israel. Weapons smuggling persists. Corporal Shalit remains captive, and Palestinians are deeply divided. It is not as if the war changed nothing. Many hundreds lost their lives, tens of thousands their livelihood, and a new political landscape has emerged, but the war changed nothing for the better." Similarly, And I want to get back to the issue of aid and reconstruction because there's about $4.5 billion today earmarked for Gaza reconstruction that have yet to enter Gaza. But the only reason they're not entering Gaza is nobody wants to give Hamas $4.5 billion to distribute in Gaza and to oversee the rebuilding of Gaza. So while we still try to politically figure out how and who is going to oversee Gaza reconstruction, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of citizens still sleeping on the streets in Gaza because their homes were destroyed in the bombing. And you should think about the whole idea of deterrence. I mean, I question the usefulness of a deterrence strategy where you're raising entire generations under harsh circumstances who will know nothing but hatred of Israel in the future because of what the devastation is doing to their daily lives. I've often also heard, and it really troubles me when I hear that some people will say, Israel's 2006 Lebanon war was really successful because since the 2006 war, Hezbollah hasn't launched attacks into Israel. So that deterrence is working at its best. But this is an interesting quote that I also came across in a report, an analysis on the situation. Oh, sorry, where's that quote? Okay, well, I can't find the quote, but let me just kind of rephrase it for you. Basically, the idea is that since the 2006, I think I have it here on the slide, I'm sorry. Here we go, there we go. Though Hezbollah has frozen its attacks on the Sheba farms, it has mounted a rearmament, recruitment, and training drive and drawn up fresh battle plans. Israeli intelligence says Hezbollah has amassed 3 times the number of rockets it had at the start of the 2006 war. Sheikh Nasrallah says the Zionists will discover that the war they had in July 2006 was a walk in the park if we compare it to what we've prepared for every new aggression. So in other words, yes, there's now this temporary moment of calm as a result of the Lebanese invasion, but look at the amount of amassing, recruitment, mobilization, socialization of sheer hatred towards Israel. I mean, I question the whole rationale of a deterrence that relies on just outright hatred and mutual hate and destruction of the other rather than reconciliation and moving towards political settlements and negotiations and working towards that framework. So I guess kind of wrapping up, because I know I need to leave some time for questions and answers, is that we're at a point, and if we just even look at what happened between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu 2 days ago in D.C., we're at a point where the political settlement is very elusive. There's very little, I mean, in my opinion, the U.S. administration is really trying to push for a political settlement right now, but there's really no interest on the Israeli side to move on the issue of the West Bank and to look at the future Palestinian state on the West Bank as really internal to Israel's own security objectives in the long run. Israel's far more interested now in dealing with Iran, and the idea that, you know, Iran first and the Palestinians later, again, what's the logic of that? I mean, should another whole generations of Palestinians have to grow under Israeli occupation? I mean, again, there needs to be a movement on the political settlement of this conflict. And I really have become increasingly more pessimistic, unfortunately. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Jamal has agreed to take some questions from the audience. I thought we had a microphone going around. We do. So if you need voice amplification, we have a microphone that's going to be circulating. As is our policy, we like to take questions from Dartmouth students first, if possible, and then follow up with community members. But if there are no Dartmouth student questions, then please feel free to ask your questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And you're going to field your own questions?
Yes, I'll field my own questions. So there are no questions? Okay. Oh, sorry.
I'm not a student, but I guess no one else wants to talk. Is it still any consideration that Gaza, if you could get a separate Palestinian state, will Gaza still be part of it?
That's a good question. I mean, ideally, it should be part of a future Palestinian state, and that's really going to depend on whether or not Hamas and Fatah can work out I mean, even let's just assume that Israel and the United States will allow for a national unity government. There's still a lot of outstanding issues now between Fatah and Hamas. Security forces, portfolios, ministries, a lot of that. So, I mean, my reading of the situation is that if there were a viable political settlement on the table, and if you look at Palestinian public opinion, they would very much urge Hamas and Fatah to form a Palestinian unity government. So it might come from pressure from below. But now, since it's like putting the cart before the horse, if you may, everybody's trying to kind of claim more and stick by their own kind of polarized positions. The idea is, even there, I mean, if we could make concessions on the West Bank right now, I mean, there's been a lot said. Look, since Gaza, on the West Bank, we didn't see a lot of outrage. The PA was in control of the situation, so maybe Mahmoud Abbas is gradually appropriating the Palestinian street, or at least he can control the population, whether or not we're mindful of human rights or not. But besides the issue is that his authority is strong, but then that has to be accompanied by political concessions as well. And again, we haven't seen that. Those are the movements. I mean, they're now building a new settlement. It was just 2 or 3 days ago announced in the valley next to Jericho. Settlements are not conducive to the peace process. I mean, every settlement that goes up really hurts the Palestinian Authority. And it's, I think what the Palestinians are saying now, it's okay, it's fine. If there's not going to be a Palestinian state, what will be the status of Palestinian citizens? And so that's a big question. And so there needs to be some hope for the Palestinians that they're not going to be locked up in enclaves and subordinate to an Israeli political establishment. Either they're going to be independent Palestinians, or somebody needs to give them a different idea. Will they be Israeli citizens? Will they be, what is the future for these people? Oh.
What are the 5 bullet points for a political settlement?
The 5, if I had the
you
power.
were addressing it, what are the 5 bullet points that would do the job?
The first one, go back to Sharm el-Sheikh. Basically, look at the things that I know, and I don't know a lot, but what I know. Okay. Basically, I think we kind of know what the future Palestinian state is going to look like, right? It's going to be Gaza, and there's going to be some configuration of the West Bank minus a huge chunk around Jerusalem.
Is that Oslo?
That's Sharm el-Sheikh 2000. Let me go back to here. This is what it's really going to have to look like. I think there's consensus that if they're going to move forward, here, this is going to be the future Palestinian state here. You're going to see a huge settlement block that's going to go back to Israel. There's talk about some of these other settlements staying, but there's going to be a land lease situation. So Israel they will lease the land from the Palestinians on a 99-year base, but they will be governed totally by Israel. I've heard that they've worked out these issues. I've also heard that they've worked out a lot of the refugee issues, the right of return issues. The big issue, so 5 bullet points. Boundaries here. You have to give control over the holy sites, the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, to the Palestinians, because that was an outstanding issue. And basically the wall has to come down. I mean, you can keep the wall on the borders between Palestine and Israel, but not in the West Bank. I mean, you can't have a Palestinian independent state with the Israeli military presence and civilian presence on the West Bank the way it is now. And the settlement issue is a huge one for the Israelis, and I think that's what it's going to come. The issue is going to come down to settlements, and if it's not going to be resolved, if there's no way to conceive of a future Israeli state minus the settlements, then there needs to be another strategy on the table. What are you going to do with the Palestinians on the West Bank? You can't keep on saying that you need to have an empowered Palestinian government because we don't have anybody to talk to, and if we have somebody to talk to, well, we're not going to give them anything, because that's not working anymore. I mean, there needs to be hope for these people in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, it has to give. Those were not 5 bullet points. 2 more to go.
She did it in 3. Congratulations.
Well, let me tell you. I don't know about. Cause I'm not going to put the 5 bullet points. But again, again, if I was doing this, there should be joint patrolling of the borders with some type of international observers on the ground. I don't know, UN, American, anybody, to make sure that the whole suicide issue, bombings are not happening, so that the borders are secure on both sides. But I also understand that on public opinion side of it, in the bilateral negotiations, so this is not a bullet point, this is just an aside. In the bilateral negotiations, what the Israelis and the Palestinians have done is that they've put together packages. So if you say to the Israelis, for example, are you willing to support complete dismantlement of all the outpost settlements in the West Bank for peace? The majority of Israelis will say, no, not really. But if you say to the Israelis, what about, here's the final status on Jerusalem, here's the final status on settlements, here's the final status on refugees and borders, will you accept this package? And similarly, they've done the same thing on the Palestinian side. Apparently now they have a formula that receives 60+% on both sides, and it's a comparable formula for both sides. So that gives me some hope. But the fact of the matter is, every time I talk to anybody in the bilateral track, they say, we're this close to figuring it all out. And I've heard this year in and year out. And then like a month later, there's war. So I'm also losing my faith in what's happening in the bilateral track.
Don't lose your faith.
So thank you. Yeah.
Why is the Palestinian economy required to be dependent upon the Israeli economy, and why cannot commerce flow through the Jordanian and the Egyptian borders?
That's a good point. I mean, ideally, you would want the Palestinian, I mean, that's been the basic contention. The Palestinians would like to have full control and access to, the Egyptian border and the Jordanian border. The Israelis won't allow it. It will compromise the security. But during Oslo, they had worked out a lot of coordinating mechanisms to get around this. I mean, there's always going to be an Israeli presence now on the borders, right? But the idea is when the borders are used as a means of collective punishment, you can't have, for example, Gaza very much relies on agriculture. You can't have tomatoes sit at the border in the heat of Gaza for more than like 6 hours because they'll rot. I mean, you need to be able to put your tomatoes on your truck and get them out of the strip. And since what the Palestinians have said, fine, if Israel wants to be on the borders, fine, but let's think of a way to expedite the importing and the exporting of businesses. So no, what does it look like in Gaza? The way it was working, at least for the longest time, now it's not even working, but it was working this way. Let's say you're a farmer. So you've harvested your crops and you have a bunch of tomatoes. You have to go to the border with Israel. Israel will not allow your truck to go through Israel because that's a security risk. So you have to now take all your agriculture your produce out of the truck and load it onto trucks on the other side. Then you have to, let's say you're going to the West Bank, you get all the way to the border of the West Bank. The Palestinians won't allow the Israeli truck to get in because that's what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. So you have to take all the tomatoes out of the truck again, load them on the Palestinian truck, and then distribute them. Quite honestly, by then, the Israeli produce has already been sitting in the markets in the West Bank for about a few hours, and they're fresher, So this is kind of what's going on. So I think what the Palestinians are saying, yes, we understand. I mean, they really don't understand, but they're willing to accept the fact that, they have no choice, that the Israelis will be on the borders. But we need to think, and there were, at one point, I remember hearing all these discussions about new X-ray systems that would X-ray trucks going in and out of Israel, like a very sophisticated system of surveillance. But nevertheless, this is one of the big outstanding issues.
Are you saying that the Israelis are controlling the borders into Jordan and into Egypt as well?
Yeah. If you now are Palestinian and you travel from Jordan into Palestine, the first security checkpoint you're going to hit is the Israeli security checkpoint. Then you'll hit the Palestinian security checkpoint. Nobody cares about the Palestinian security checkpoint, but you're going to hit the Israeli one. And if you similarly, it's the same thing on Gaza. Mm-hmm.
I guess, this is just sort of a reflection of my lack of knowledge about the region in general, but one of the things that strikes me about this map is that you have these very small disjointed enclaves, like, as you described, they're distinct and separate from each other. And I wasn't aware that basically there's not only checkpoints sort of around the borders, but there's actually checkpoints in between enclaves.
Right.
Has it ever been, gone on the table of possibly removing those barriers so that at least internally sort of,
I mean-
you have movement of goods and stuff?
Yeah, no, it's movement of, look at, so many people, just like, again, I want to go back. This has been the big Palestinian complaint, is that they're being suffocated by the checkpoints on the West Bank. You can't get to school. You can't get to healthcare. Like, if you look at, like, Palestine, like, all the good healthcare, or the people who are who specialize, like the cardiologists, the people who, I can't even remember the names now of the specialists. People who specialize in diabetes, and they're in the cities. But you have huge populations in the surrounding villages, and these are people who are not even able to access health care. A lot of women have given birth at the checkpoints because while they're waiting to get cleared to get into the hospitals to give birth. So this is really hampering Palestinian internal daily life. There's a lot of push for this. There's a lot of complaining. A lot of human rights reports are being filed. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas are saying these checkpoints have to be removed to no avail.
What is if you can sort of turn the tables and kind of put yourself in the Israeli sort of position, what is the benefit of having these internal checkpoints? Like, why are they there?
I think, a variety of reasons. One is that if we go back to this map here, these are all settlements here. So you want to keep Palestinians as far away from the settlements as possible, right? So and you want to basically internally police the West Bank to make sure that you don't have people carrying arms, you don't have people involved in political activity that is going to be used against Israel. So the idea is to protect the settlement population. You have to basically keep your presence alive and well on the West Bank to surveil the entire population. And because if let's say the checkpoints are gone and Israel's only bordering here, right? Then what's going to happen to all the settlement people living here? They're citizens of Israel and they're demanding representation. I think, let me just put it out there. Oftentimes I think, like, if you may, the hugest mistake the Palestinians will do over and over, especially in the diaspora communities here in the United States, they often talk about the right of return, right? The Palestinians in Lebanon and Jordan returning to dilute the Jewish majority in Israel. That's not these Palestinians here, quite honestly, they can, as bad as this sounds, their number one issue is not the refugees in Lebanon. In fact, when those refugees in Lebanon were polled, a huge majority didn't even want to return to Israel, right? And when those results were reported, that was a political catastrophe, and people who reported the polls were actually beaten up. But that's besides the issue, right? Because this is a negotiating card, right? But the big issue, the thing that really stands between a settlement, between Israelis and Palestinians, is the settlement issue. Is the settlement issue is huge. It's everywhere. If you travel on the West Bank, you look on almost every hilltop. There's either a settlement being prepared to be built. You see them. You see the bypass roads. The bypass roads are huge because they're like American highways versus the small dinky roads the Palestinians have. I visited Ramallah. Before Oslo, I have relatives who live 7 miles away from Ramallah, and it used to take us 10 minutes to get to Ramallah. In the car, take us 10 minutes to get to Ramallah. Now, guess how long it takes us to get to Ramallah? 1 hour and 15 minutes. And let me tell you why. Because they put up a checkpoint and a barrier between the village and Ramallah. And now we have to travel all the way through all these dinky small villages on the roads that were built during the British Mandate. Like, those are the roads that if you hit 2 cars, one of them is going to fall off the road almost. So you pray the whole time that you don't fall off the road while you're going to Ramallah. And the kids won't go with me because they get nauseated because the roads are like yee. And so it's just horrible. It's horrible. And so every time you want to go to Ramallah for health care, I want to go there just to see friends and get good food and things like that. It's inconvenient. It's really inconvenient. And this is, all of the West Bank is this way. It's divided. You're just looking for these roads in the mountains to get from one place to another place. It's a ridiculous way to live.
Can you follow the accounts of proceedings at the checkpoints and the military personnel who are carrying out the occupation, I frequently, I won't say got the impression, but I've wondered whether the Israeli army is completely under civilian control. I almost get the feeling sometimes that the army is manned by the far, far right, and that the harassment and illegal activity that the soldiers either turn their eyes away from or promote isn't what the civilian government would wish them to do. But I'm just asking, am I right about that?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, I don't know what goes on in the Israeli military. Like, if they're socialized, if they're trained to do what they do. And I want to also kind of nuance what I said. I mean, there are times where I've been at Israeli checkpoints and I'll get an Israeli. I mean, these are, first of all, these are young Israeli men and they have to serve. So I want to be honest, like, it's not all of them are just dying to be on the West Bank. They'd rather be on Tel Aviv, having a fun time, be on the West Bank with all these little, you look at some soldiers and, they're conflicted about their service. And you see that. I get soldiers who say, you're from the United States. Why are you even bothering coming here? Like, just go through, get out fast, So we often say, like, every time you approach a checkpoint, I hope we get a good Israeli, I hope we get a soft-hearted Israeli, because then we're not going to be harassed as much. And it's random. It's really random sometimes. So that leads me to believe that there's not this one monolithic Israeli army. I also know, when I talk to my Israeli friends, that they're horrified with some of the abuses that are reported on the West Bank. So it's not fair to say that this is an Israeli civilian military that has the full support of the Israeli population behind it. I think there's also, though, in Israel, unfortunately, kind of like don't know, don't see, don't want to know what's going on in the West Bank also. Yeah. So there's a lot of that going on. Kind of like, yeah, we know what's going on, but we don't want to be reminded of it. Unfortunately, this is, I think, more of a recent phenomenon. In the 1990s, it wasn't. People wanted to know. People stood up. And you look at the peace movement in Israel, it was huge, right? We don't see that outrage that we used to see in Israel, especially during the Gaza incursion. That was disappointing to me personally, as somebody who has been involved in this. I would have expected to see more outrage at the Israeli level. There probably was, but we didn't see it also. I don't know if it was controlled by their media or not, but I hope that answers your question. Right here, yeah.
What effect do you think the recent elections, particularly the election of Netanyahu and his foreign minister Lieberman, will have? I feel like in the history of Israel, especially with the new party, Israel Beiteinu, this is probably one of the more conservative governments that we've seen. And what effect do you think that will have on the expansion of settlements and the continued destruction of the wall?
Yeah, I think this government, unfortunately, is very much committed to expanding the settlements, is very much committed to seeing the wall completed on the territory that it was, initially, with shrinking the West Bank state. It's a very conservative government. I mean, Netanyahu has been very public about the fact that he doesn't think there's any reason to move on the peace front or peace talks with the Palestinians right now. I mean, Israel's major concern is Iran. And there's really, from Israel's perspective, there's emerged sort of like a status quo bias. Things are okay, we can handle it, and we don't need to look 20 years down the line in terms of what this is going to do to the Palestinians and to our own moral standing, or their moral standing. I mean, so unfortunately, I'm not optimistic with where the Israeli government is, or at least what it's been saying. Now, I've always said that if anybody's going to deliver on the peace front and be able to sell it to their own people, a right-wing government can do that more effectively in Israel than a left-wing government. So if Netanyahu was going to strike a peace deal, I think he could carry it through the Israeli public. But I don't know if he's committed to that. I hope that answers. Mm-hmm.
What is the point exactly of these settlements for the Israeli state? I mean, they are expanding their population, but to the point you said that they don't really need all that expansion. It seems like they're trying to appropriate the entire West Bank for themselves.
No. I mean, back in the 70s, the expansion of the settlements starts way back in the 70s. And here there were a lot of settlements put up by the Jordan River. Those were what were called security settlements, right? If we have settlements, Israel can be there, kind of secure the borders. There was no peace treaty with Jordan. Kind of like the same idea with the settlements in the Sinai before the peace treaty with Egypt. So it starts out with a left-wing security concern, but then there's the religious momentum, the religious conviction, the Jewish, and this is not all of the Jewish Israelis believe this, but a significant percentage of Israelis believe that this land is their land by divine right, and to compromise the land of Judea and Samaria is to give up something, is to compromise the religion. And so this is for them unforeseeable to be removed in the long run. And it's a huge issue. And so their settlement activity on the West Bank kind of also like to appease the religious establishment internally in Israel. And if you go to Tel Aviv, you'll see posters in Tel Aviv and other places, in Haifa and places that will say, like, you'll get all these discounted rates if you live in the West Bank, if you buy a house on the West Bank. It makes a lot, and there's some people who are there because of that, because it's more economically viable to be on the West Bank than to be in Jerusalem, where real estate is very expensive and whatnot. So there are a lot of things going on, but the big issue is the religious claims to this land. And again, but once this conflict is going to be resolved by religious claims, then we're going nowhere. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We go here, then we'll back over here. Sorry.
In the Middle East, a lot of Arab governments have been criticized by their own citizens for not exerting enough pressure to come to a viable resolution to this problem, especially with the recent Gaza crisis. What do you think the Arab governments could have done, and could they have even made an impact, on this situation?
See, the Arab government. She was asking what the Arab governments could do to kind of, I guess, pressure a solution, or Israel or the United States.
There's a lot of the general feeling is a lot of Arab citizens, who are under very sort of repressive or authoritarian governments, feel that their governments aren't doing enough and that they're, under Washington's heel.
Right.
So what could they have done anything, and would it have made a difference in your opinion?
Could the Arab governments have done anything to make a difference? See, on the one hand, the Arab governments, certainly they could be giving more humanitarian aid. Just at the basic level. They've been very stingy with humanitarian aid, except for the Gaza incursion, right? Now they've earmarked, the Saudis pledged $1 billion, the Kuwaitis pledged $2 billion, so that's generous, and we're not going to argue with that. But before, they certainly could have done more to also empower or financially enable the Palestinian Authority internally. I'm not going to blame and sit there and say, well, it's everybody's responsibility to feed the Palestinians, but nevertheless, it's an issue that matters in the region. The most promising initiative out there, in my opinion, is the Saudi initiative of 2002, which basically says, all the Arab states will recognize Israel, and Israel should then withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza to the 67 borders, and there'll be full diplomatic and economic relations with the state of Israel. I think that's very promising, because I honestly believe also, aside from the normative benefit of basically full recognition of the state of Israel, ending the war and hostility, or at least creating a coalition of Arab states and Israel to fight against would-be aggressors, right? Because now we have other issues. Iran and, there's other issues in the region, would be much more meaningful than keeping the status quo the way it is, A. But B, these Arab states that we talk about are all disasters economically as well, right? The Jordanian economy, the Egyptian economy, the Saudi economy, all of them need to have a climate that is more hospitable to foreign direct investment. And with Iraq unstable, with Syria unstable, with Lebanon, we don't know where it stands, trying to move the region as a whole, and I'm not saying that this all hinges on Israel, but nevertheless, Israel's part of the formula, trying to have a more stable Middle East in the long run, right, is in everybody's interest. It's in Israel's interest, it's in the Arab interest, it's in the U.S. interest, because what's happening is that I think 100 million jobs need to be created in the next 20 years to absorb the youth bulge of the region, right? We have a tremendous youth bulge in that region. And we know that there are not going to be enough jobs. I mean, we already have an unemployment crisis across these states. It's only going to get worse. And that we already know that the youth of the region turn to radicalism when there's dire economic situations. That means we don't really have good prospects for that as well, right? Insofar as that if we're thinking strategically ahead, this needs to be an economically viable region. I mean, it needs to be able to absorb its own citizens. And right now, all economic outlooks tell you it's not. And one of the ways we can get a better, at least, economic environment in the region is through foreign direct investment. But that you need stability. Nobody's going to take their resources and invest in countries and in a region which is war torn, and everybody's waiting for the next kind of catastrophe. So I hope that.
Offer will be on the table, because even the Saudi government has said, going back to the pre-1967 borders is what we're saying now, but that offer isn't always going to be on the table.
I personally think that's just like also right now, kind of like flexing muscles, I mean, it's going to be on the table. That's the only solution. Everybody knows it's the only solution. The issue is how do we get there? And will we get there right now? Yeah, you. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Going back to a previous question, you mentioned that there was a majority of Israelis, or I'm not sure exactly what your wording was, supporting the settlement efforts. I was under the impression that significant. Sorry, I was under the impression that the percentage of Israelis comprising the Orthodox Jewish movement who are adamant about the territorial integrity of Eretz Israel was significantly less than 20%, including the Gush Emanim and the Haredim, who are the major proponents. And I was under the impression that the majority of their power came not from their numbers, nor the majority that they comprise of Israelis, but rather the fact that these conservative governments, in order to dominate parliament, needed coalitions, and therefore needed these small religious groups to support them, and therefore, in order to appease them so that they didn't fracture that coalition majority, they would refuse to criticize or remove settlements. Mm-hmm. But I thought that this was, in terms of population and demographics, I thought that this was a small population, whereas something like 60 to 70% of Israelis were strongly against the idea of settlements and strongly in favor of a two-state solution.
Great. No, absolutely. I mean, you're right on target. I mean, there's the significant percentage of support for the settlements from within the Orthodox movement is around 20 to 25% of the Israeli population. I mean, just go back one second. There's significant support for the two-state solution on both sides of the Palestinian-Israeli publics right now. But there's also a growing conviction in Israel that the settlements are important for not necessarily security. Unfortunately, what's happened in Israel since Camp David, and I believe here it's really the way the Camp David fiasco was spun in the media, is that the Palestinians were offered everything, and they refused it because you know why? The Palestinians inherently want to destroy the state of Israel. And in Israel, there's been in Israel, what you've seen now is, well, if that's the Palestinian attitude, we're going to keep our settlements in the West Bank. And hence, you don't see the type of public outcry you used to see, right, in Israel against settlement expansion. So when I say significant, I'm kind of not only trying to capture the religious conviction of people who are there, and you're right on target to point out the whole coalitional politics behind it, but there's also a growing segment of the Israeli public, although who probably inherently don't believe that the settlements are legitimate. They're like, they've more or less, it's over there, it's out there, it doesn't bother me right now. And there's more hesitancy, if you may, to fracture Israeli society around the issue of settlements when there's no faith that the Palestinians are not going to destroy the state of Israel. And so this is also, and this is kind of the sentiment now. I mean, I sat next to an Israeli in the airport coming back from Tel Aviv. He said, I'm not saying this is not, I hate when people, by the way, take one viewpoint and say, here's now what the whole population thinks. I also make that this is one opinion. But, he sat with me in the airplane, And, you know, he said, I was, you know, for the two-state solution, I supported a Palestinian state, and after Oslo, I've become more convinced that the Palestinians are never going to want to live side by Israel. And I was, of course, arguing the other case, right? No, you have to understand, of course, that, you know, they'll live side by side and blah, 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 blah. And he said that what he would rather see is that if there would be some solution where Israelis could buy land from Palestinians on the West Bank and basically gradually just buy over the West Bank, that would be the perfect solution to the whole conflict. Now, this is not saying this is by any means a majority or significant viewpoint, but like,
Try that with the Jewish National Fund beforehand. That didn't seem to work out very well.
well, yeah, but I mean, they did buy significant pockets of land, right? I mean, so, you know, but let's not even go there right now. But the idea is, I mean, so what I'm trying to say is that in Israel, what you've seen is kind of like, you know, we were getting whole about the peace process. Now we're kind of more lukewarm. And, you know, and unfortunately, you know, what the Israeli pulse matters for this conflict, because let's just be honest about it. When the Israelis go to the election booth, they're going to elect leaders who are going to determine the future of the peace process. And so it really matters to understand where Israelis stand on this conflict.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.